There seems to be an unspoken rule in nature where stepping into the water means accepting that you've entered a world designed to kill you in ways land never could. This is a truth we carry in our bones today, an instinct that makes us scan dark water nervously, that sends shivers down our spine when something brushes our leg in the ocean. It's why we build pools instead of swimming in lakes, why we fear what we cannot see beneath the surface. This fear is justified. Throughout Earth's history, the oceans have been home to nightmares that make horror movies look tame. But there was one moment, one bizarre chapter in our planet's story where this fundamental rule was completely reversed. A time when diving into the water was your best chance at survival, when the land had become so horrifically dangerous that even the most terrifying ocean predators seemed like a better option. So, if these stories help you relax or whatever, hit like or subscribe. Also curious where everyone's at. Comment your city and time, reading through last video's comments and seeing Miami, Manchester and Melbourne all in there. The internet's weird, right? This wasn't just a bad day or a rough century. This was millions of years where the entire surface of our planet transformed into something that shouldn't have been possible, a hellscape that makes you wonder how anything survived at all. And the thing is, most things didn't. We're talking about the Lopingian, a name that probably means absolutely nothing to you right now, but represents the last gasp of an entire era of life on Earth. This was the final epoch of the Permian period, playing out between 259 and 252 million years ago, long before dinosaurs were even a concept. To put this in perspective, when this story begins, the dinosaurs wouldn't exist for another 7 million years. Mammals? They were still 30 million years away from their first appearance. This was a completely alien world, and it was about to become even more alien. Picture this for a second. You wake up tomorrow and discover that the moon is hanging lower in the sky, close enough that you can make out individual craters with the naked eye. The sun rises earlier than it should and sets earlier too, because the entire day only lasts 22 hours instead of 24. You check your GPS, but it's useless because there's only one continent on the entire planet, a massive supercontinent called Pangea that makes modern Asia look like a small island. North America is fused to Europe, South America is welded to Africa, Antarctica is attached to India, and you could walk from what would become New York to what would become Beijing without getting your feet wet. But you probably wouldn't want to make that walk because Pangea during the Lopingian was experiencing something that modern Earth has never seen. The interior of this supercontinent was so far from any ocean that moisture simply couldn't reach it. Imagine the Sahara Desert, then multiply it by 10. Now make it hotter. The average temperature across much of Pangea was 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Not during summer, not during heat waves. That was just normal. Every day, all year. And this wasn't the kind of dry heat that you might find pleasant in Arizona. This was the kind of heat that bakes the ground until it cracks like broken pottery, where rain might not fall for decades at a time. The central Pangean Mountains, a range that stretched across the entire horizontal length of the continent, created rain shadows so severe that entire regions hadn't seen significant precipitation in millions of years. If you think Death Valley is harsh, the Lopingian interior would have made Death Valley look like a tropical resort. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean terrifying. Despite these conditions, or maybe because of them, life hadn't given up. It had adapted, evolved, and in many cases had become absolutely monstrous. The creatures that managed to survive in this environment weren't just tough, they were nightmares given form, the result of millions of years of evolution pushing life to its absolute limits. Now, you might think that in such a hostile environment, the oceans would be a refuge, a place where life could thrive away from the scorching heat and endless drought, and you'd be partially right. The oceans were indeed a refuge, but not because they were thriving. They were a refuge because they were dying more slowly than the land. Let me paint you a picture of what swimming in the Lopingian Ocean would have been like. First, forget everything you know about modern marine life. No whales, no dolphins, no sea turtles, no coral reefs as we know them. The oceans were dominated by creatures that would seem utterly alien to us today. The biggest predators in the water were sharks, but not the sharks you're thinking of. The helicoprion, that bizarre shark with the circular saw of teeth that you might have seen in prehistoric documentaries, had already gone extinct by this point. What remained were smaller, less impressive species. The largest sharks swimming around during the Lopingian were the eugeniodontids, reaching maybe 2 meters in length. That's about 6.5 feet, roughly the size of a leopard shark today. Not exactly Jaws material. Their teeth were designed for soft prey like squids and small fish, not for tearing apart large animals. If you encountered one while swimming, it would probably be more afraid of you than you were of it. The other major predators in the water were even less impressive. The eurypterids, or sea scorpions, that had once grown to the size of crocodiles and terrorized the seas for hundreds of millions of years, were now on their last legs, or last swimming paddles, I suppose. Only 2 genera are known from the Lopingian, and neither were particularly large or dangerous. These once mighty predators had been reduced to bit players in their own domain, struggling just to survive. The trilobites, those iconic fossils that every kid who's ever been to a natural history museum has seen, were almost gone. After thriving for nearly 300 million years, only 7 species remained by the Lopingian. 7 out of the thousands that had once existed. One of the last members of this once great group was Cathwaya capitorosa, a name that sounds impressive until you realize it was only a few centimeters long. Even the ammonoids, those spiral-shelled relatives of modern squids and octopi, were in decline. The old Paleozoic orders were fading away, being slowly replaced by new groups that would eventually dominate the Mesozoic seas. But during the Lopingian, neither group was particularly diverse or abundant. You might be wondering what had happened to make the oceans so empty. The answer lies in an event that occurred just 2 million years before our story begins, an extinction event that most people have never heard of, but which was actually more severe than the one that killed the dinosaurs. The Capetanian mass extinction, named after the Capetanian age of the Guadalupian epoch, had devastated marine life. Some estimates suggest that 60% of marine genera disappeared. The oceans were still reeling from this catastrophe, and they would never fully recover before the next hammer blow fell. But here's the thing that makes the Lopingian so unique, so absolutely unprecedented in Earth's history. While the oceans were limping along with their depleted ecosystems, life on land had gone in the completely opposite direction. Instead of becoming emptier and safer, the land had become packed with predators, each one more terrifying than the last. The extinction that had devastated the seas had created opportunities on land, and evolution had filled those opportunities with teeth. The rulers of the old world, massive plant-eating creatures called dinocephalians that could weigh as much as 2 tons, had been wiped out. These were the elephants of their day, huge herbivores that no predator could bring down. With them gone, the entire ecosystem had restructured itself, and the new structure was built on terror. Enter the Gorgonopsids, a name that literally means gorgon-faced after the monsters from Greek mythology whose gaze could turn you to stone. The scientists who discovered these creatures took one look at their fossilized skulls and decided that naming them after mythological monsters was the only appropriate choice, and they were right. Gorgonopsids weren't mammals, but they weren't quite reptiles either. They were something in between, part of a group called therapsids that would eventually give rise to mammals millions of years later. But don't let their position as our distant ancestors fool you into thinking they were cuddly or primitive. These were sophisticated killing machines that had evolved one of the most terrifying adaptations in prehistoric history: saber teeth. When we think of saber-toothed predators, most of us picture the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon, from the Ice Age, but Smilodon was just copying what the Gorgonopsids had already perfected 250 million years earlier. These weren't just big teeth, they were precisely engineered weapons designed for one purpose: delivering death as efficiently as possible. The largest of these monsters was Inostrantsev, named after Russian geologist Alexander Inostrantsev. Imagine a creature with the body of a bear, the head of a wolf, and the teeth of a nightmare. Adults could grow over 11 feet long and weigh more than 1,000 pounds. That's 453 kilograms for those keeping track. To put this in perspective, that's larger than most modern lions, and unlike lions, Inostrantsev hunted alone. Its skull alone could reach 2 feet in length, with upper canines that extended 6 inches below the jaw. These weren't just for show. The teeth were curved backward, serrated like steak knives, and positioned perfectly to punch through thick hide and reach vital organs. When Inostrantsev bit down, those teeth would sink deep into its prey, severing arteries and puncturing lungs. Death would come quickly, but not pleasantly. But here's what made Inostrantsev truly terrifying. It was everywhere. Fossils have been found from Russia to South Africa to China. This wasn't some localized predator confined to a single region. This was a global nightmare that had achieved something few predators ever manage: total continental domination. Whether you were in the frozen wastes of what would become Siberia or the scorching deserts of future South Africa, Inostrantsev was there, waiting. The hunting strategy of these creatures is still debated by paleontologists, but the two leading theories are equally terrifying. The first suggests they hunted like saber-toothed cats, using their massive canines to deliver a killing bite to the throat, severing the windpipe and major blood vessels in one swift attack. The second theory is somehow worse. They might have used a bite-and-run strategy, inflicting massive wounds and then following their prey at a safe distance while blood loss and shock did the real work. Imagine being bitten by something with 6-inch teeth and then being stalked for hours or days while you slowly bled out. Nature, it seems, has always been creative in its cruelty. But Inostrantsev was just the beginning. In what would become South Africa, an entire subfamily of giant Gorgonopsids had evolved independently. These were the Rubiginae, named after the Rubige family who owned the farm where the first fossils were found. If Inostrantsev was built like a bear, the Rubigines were built like tanks. Take Rubigia atrox, whose name literally means terrible rubige. This monster could grow 10 feet long, with a skull that made up 15% of its total body length. That skull was reinforced with thick bone, especially around the areas where the jaw muscles attached. This wasn't just for protection, it was for power. Those reinforced areas allowed for massive jaw muscles that could drive its serrated teeth through almost anything. The teeth themselves were even more specialized than those of Inostrancevia. They were deeply serrated, with cutting edges that were reportedly even more efficient at slicing through flesh. They also had a unique feature: frequent tooth replacement. Unlike mammals, which typically only get 2 sets of teeth in their lifetime, Rubigea could replace its teeth throughout its life. Every time a tooth broke or wore down from crunching through bone, a new one would grow in its place. It was a killing machine that never dulled. But here's the really disturbing part. Rubigea didn't hunt alone. Evidence suggests that South Africa during the Lopingian was home to 9 different genera of Rubigene gorgonopsids, all living at the same time, all occupying the same regions. These weren't different species, filling different niches. These were all large apex predators competing for the same prey. Imagine the Serengeti, but instead of having lions as the only big cats, you had 9 different species of lion-sized predators all trying to make a living in the same space. And then, just to make things worse, Inostrancevia showed up in South Africa too. The fossil evidence suggests that this Russian monster somehow made its way south and established itself in territories already packed with rubigenes. The result would have been a predator density unlike anything seen before or since. Every waterhole, every game trail, every shaded spot where herbivores might rest would have been a potential killing ground. You might be wondering how any herbivores survived at all in this predator-packed hellscape. The answer is that they evolved their own set of nightmare adaptations. They became living tanks, walking fortresses, and professional escape artists. But that's a story for the next part of our journey into the Lopingian, when we'll discover that even the plant-eaters of this era were terrifying in their own right, and why even they weren't safe from what was coming. So, you might think the herbivores just gave up and accepted their fate as walking lunchboxes. You'd be wrong, dead wrong. What happened instead was one of the most insane evolutionary arms races our planet has ever seen. The plant-eaters didn't just adapt, they became monsters in their own right. Let's start with Scutosaurus, whose name means shield lizard, though calling this thing a lizard is like calling a tank a shopping cart. This creature weighed over 1.2 tons, roughly the weight of a small car, and its entire body was essentially a biological fortress. We're not talking about a few bony plates here and there. The skin of Scutosaurus was embedded with hundreds of thick overlapping armor plates called osteoderms, turning its entire body into something like medieval chainmail made of bone. But the armor wasn't even the most impressive part. The skull of Scutosaurus was adorned with thick spikes and horns that jutted out at angles designed to make biting it a nightmare. Imagine trying to bite a porcupine that weighs as much as a car and fights back. The bones themselves were so dense that they were essentially solid. No hollow spaces, no weight-saving measures. This animal had sacrificed speed for pure, impenetrable defense. When threatened, Scutosaurus would lower its head and charge, using its reinforced skull like a battering ram. Those spikes weren't just defensive, they were weapons. A charging Scutosaurus could probably punch holes through anything stupid enough to stand in its way. And here's the thing, this strategy worked. We know it worked because Scutosaurus fossils are everywhere in the late Permian rocks. This wasn't some rare, struggling species. This was one of the most successful animals of its time. But not every herbivore could afford to be a walking tank. Some took a different approach entirely. Enter Lystrosaurus, a creature so bizarre that when scientists first found its fossils, they couldn't figure out what they were looking at. Picture an animal about 3 feet long with the body of a pig, the stance of a lizard, and a face that only a mother could love. It had a flat, beaked face with 2 tusks sticking out like a walrus, but positioned more like an elephant's. It looked like someone had tried to draw a mammal from memory and gotten everything slightly wrong. But Lystrosaurus had a secret weapon that no predator could counter. It could dig. Those powerful front limbs weren't just for walking, they were excavation equipment. When danger approached, Lystrosaurus would disappear underground, burrowing deep into the earth where even the longest teeth couldn't reach. These weren't simple hidey holes either. Fossil burrows show complex tunnel systems with multiple chambers, emergency exits, and even what appear to be nursery areas for raising young. Think about that for a second. While monsters roamed the surface, entire communities of these weird pig lizards were living their lives underground, creating the world's first subway system 250 million years before humans invented the wheel. They turned the Earth itself into a fortress. But the predators weren't content with just the giant saber-toothed nightmares. Oh no, that would be too simple. While the Gorgonopsids ruled as the apex predators, an entirely different group of carnivores was evolving to fill every other predatory niche. These were the Therocephalians, which means beast heads, and they were about to make everything even worse. Therocephalians were like the Swiss Army knives of predators. Where Gorgonopsids were specialized for taking down large prey, Therocephalians evolved to do everything else. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Some were small and fast, darting between the legs of larger predators to snatch small prey. Others were medium-sized pack hunters, and some had evolved something that shouldn't have been possible in animals that ancient. Meet Eucymbersia, a Therocephalian about the size of a large dog that lived in what would become South Africa. At first glance, it didn't look particularly threatening. No massive saber teeth, no huge body, nothing that would make you run screaming. But Eucymbersia had evolved something far more sinister: venom. The skull of Eucymbersia has a deep groove running along its upper jaw, connecting to the roots of its teeth. Behind the eye socket, there's a large depression that scientists believe housed a venom gland. When it bit down, venom would flow from the gland along the groove and into the wound through specialized channels in its teeth. This wasn't a creature that killed with brute force. This was an assassin that killed with chemistry. We're talking about an animal that evolved in venomation 250 million years ago. To put that in perspective, venomous snakes wouldn't evolve for another 150 million years. This thing was so far ahead of its time that evolution had to wait millions of years to catch up with what it had created. But wait, it gets worse, or better, depending on your perspective on prehistoric horror shows. Another Therocephalian, Moscorhinus, took a completely different approach. This beast grew to the size of a modern jaguar, but had a head proportionally larger than a lion's. Its skull was broad and flat, designed for maximum bite force, and its teeth were numerous, sharp, and continuously replaced throughout its life. What made Moscorhinus particularly terrifying was its hunting strategy. Unlike the solitary Gorgonopsids, evidence suggests Moscorhinus hunted in groups. Imagine being chased not by one jaguar-sized predator with an oversized head full of teeth, but by a pack of them, coordinating their attack, cutting off escape routes, wearing down their prey through exhaustion and blood loss. And then there was Megawaitsia, a Therocephalian so large that when its fossils were first discovered, scientists thought they'd found another Gorgonopsid. We only have pieces of its skull, but those pieces suggest an animal with a head 40 to 50 centimeters long. That's nearly 20 inches of skull packed with teeth on an animal that might have been venomous. The fossils show strange channels in the bone, similar to those found in Eucymbersia, suggesting that Megawaitsia might have been a venomous giant. Imagine a venomous predator the size of a bear. Evolution, it seems, has no concept of overkill. But the therapsids weren't the only predators making life hell during the Lopingian. The ancestors of crocodiles were already experimenting with their body plan, and what they came up with was genuinely disturbing. These were the Proterosuchids, and while they looked superficially like modern crocodiles, they were actually quite different. For one thing, many of them were fully terrestrial, no lounging in rivers waiting for prey to come get a drink. These proto-crocodiles were active hunters that chased down their prey on land. They could grow up to 3 meters long, about 10 feet, with powerful legs positioned more directly under their bodies than modern crocodiles, allowing them to run faster and for longer distances. Their teeth were different too. Instead of the conical, gripping teeth of modern crocodiles, Proterosuchids had teeth that were compressed and blade-like, designed for slicing rather than holding. They didn't do the death roll. They didn't need to. They'd chase you down, slash you open, and let you bleed out while they followed at a leisurely pace. But perhaps the most unsettling predators of the Lopingian weren't on land at all. They were in the rivers and lakes, the few places where water still existed in the increasingly arid world. These were the Archegosaurids and the Rhinesuchids, massive amphibians that had taken the crocodile's ambush strategy and perfected it 200 million years before actual crocodiles figured it out. The largest of these was Uranocentrodon, a 13-foot-long monster that lived in the rivers of South Africa. Picture a salamander, but scaled up to the size of an alligator, with a head that made up nearly a third of its body length. Its skull was flat and wide, with eyes positioned on top so it could lurk just below the surface, watching. Its mouth was filled with hundreds of small, sharp teeth arranged in multiple rows like a living bear trap. When prey came to drink, Uranocentrodon would explode from the water with surprising speed. Those multiple rows of teeth would clamp down, and once they had a grip, escape was impossible. The teeth were angled backward, so struggling only drove them deeper. It would then drag its victim into the water where drowning would finish what the teeth had started. These creatures effectively made fresh water just as dangerous as the land. Every river, every lake, every waterhole was potentially hiding a 4-meter nightmare waiting for you to get thirsty. And in a world where the average temperature was pushing toward heatstroke territory, not drinking wasn't an option. Speaking of heat, let's talk about what the climate was doing to make everything worse. The interior of Pangea wasn't just hot and dry, it was experiencing weather patterns that modern Earth has never seen, without multiple continents to break up air circulation. Massive monsoons would develop along the coasts, but these weren't the regular seasonal rains you might expect. These were super monsoons that could dump a year's worth of rain in a few weeks, followed by droughts that could last decades. During the wet periods, flash floods would tear through the landscape with the force of tsunamis, carrying away everything in their path. Animals that had adapted to desert conditions would suddenly find themselves drowning in torrents of water. Then, just as suddenly as they began, the rains would stop and the killing drought would return. The fossil record from this time shows something deeply disturbing: mass death assemblages. These are locations where hundreds or thousands of animals all died at once, their bodies piled together by floodwaters or gathered around the last waterhole before it dried up. Layer after layer of these death assemblages, showing that these mass mortality events weren't rare disasters. They were regular occurrences. But here's what really drives home how insane the Lopingian was. All of this, everything I've described so far, was the good times. This was the world functioning normally. The various extinction events hadn't happened yet. The volcanic eruptions hadn't started. And the atmosphere hadn't been poisoned. This was just regular life in the Lopingian, where every day was a struggle not to be eaten, crushed, poisoned, drowned, or baked alive. And yet, somehow, life persisted. More than persisted, it thrived in its own twisted way. The arms race between predator and prey had produced some of the most remarkable adaptations in Earth's history. Armor that could stop 6-inch teeth, venom that predated snakes by millions of years, burrowing communities that turned the Earth into a refuge, pack hunting strategies that wouldn't be seen again for millions of years. You might wonder how we know all this. How can we be so sure about the behavior of animals that lived 250 million years ago? The answer lies in the rocks themselves. The Lopingian left us an incredible fossil record, particularly in places like the Karoo Basin of South Africa and the Ural Mountains of Russia. These areas were perfectly positioned to preserve fossils, catching animals in river deposits, lake beds, and flash flood sediments. We can see the bite marks on bones showing us how predators attacked. We can examine coprolites, fossilized dung to learn what they ate. We've found preserved burrow systems with animals still inside, caught by sudden floods or droughts. We've even found what appear to be hair impressions in some fossils, suggesting that at least some of these creatures had developed fur as insulation against the temperature extremes. But the most telling evidence comes from the pattern of extinctions and survivals. The fact that burrowing animals like Lystrosaurus survived while surface dwellers died tells us something profound about what was coming, because as horrible as the regular Lopingian was, it was about to get infinitely worse. The greatest catastrophe in Earth's history was about to begin, and when it did, even the monsters would run for cover. The stage was set, the players were in position, and deep beneath what would become Siberia, something was stirring, something that would make all the predators, all the armor, all the venom completely irrelevant. The countdown to the great dying had begun, and nobody knew it was coming. Something was wrong with the ground in what would become Siberia. Animals that ventured into certain valleys didn't come back. The earth would randomly crack open, releasing gases that killed everything nearby instantly. Sometimes the ground itself would get hot enough to cook anything standing on it. These were warnings, but nothing alive could read them. 252 million years ago, the planet basically decided to kill everything. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The Earth literally opened up and began vomiting death across half a continent. We call it the Siberian traps, which sounds almost clinical, scientific, safe. The reality was anything but safe. This was the largest volcanic event in the last 500 million years, and it didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. That would have been merciful. Instead, it was 2 million years of the earth bleeding lava. Try to wrap your head around those numbers. 2 million years. Humans have existed for about 300,000 years. Recorded history spans maybe 5,000. The Siberian traps erupted for a time period 6 times longer than our entire species has existed. And during that time, they covered an area larger than Europe in lava flows that were, in some places, 4 kilometers thick. That's 2.5 miles of molten rock, stacked up like a layer cake of death. But here's the thing, nobody tells you about massive volcanic eruptions. The lava is actually the least of your problems. When these eruptions started, they didn't just punch through normal rock. They hit coal beds, massive ancient coal deposits that had been buried for millions of years. When lava meets coal, you don't just get fire, you get an atmospheric bomb. The coal didn't just burn, it exploded into the atmosphere. We're talking about 3 trillion tons of carbon launched into the sky. Not million, not billion, trillion, with a T. To put that in perspective, all human activity since the Industrial Revolution has released about 1.5 trillion tons. The Siberian traps released twice that amount, and they did it in geological seconds. The sky turned black, not dark, not cloudy, black. The ash and soot blocked out so much sunlight that photosynthesis basically stopped. Plants died standing up, their cells unable to produce energy. The animals that ate those plants starved. The predators that ate those animals starved. The entire food chain collapsed from the bottom up. But wait, there's more. Because apparently just poisoning the atmosphere wasn't enough. The eruptions also released something like 18 teratons of hydrochloric acid, that's 18 trillion tons of acid, in the atmosphere, which then fell as rain. Imagine every rainstorm being made of battery acid. The rain would hit your skin and burn. It would hit leaves and dissolve them. It would hit the soil and sterilize it. Lakes turned into acid baths. Rivers became streams of poison. And we haven't even gotten to the sulfur yet. The volcanic emissions included massive amounts of sulfur dioxide, which does two fun things. First, it combines with water vapor to create sulfuric acid, adding to our acid rain problem. Second, it forms aerosols that reflect sunlight, causing global cooling. So now you have a planet that's simultaneously being poisoned, acidified, and frozen. Scientists call these volcanic winters, which sounds almost cozy. The reality was more like nuclear winter without the radiation. Temperatures would plummet by 10 or 15 degrees Celsius in a matter of weeks. Animals adapted to the heat of the late Permian would suddenly find themselves in Arctic conditions. But just when they started adapting to the cold, the sulfur would clear, and all that trapped carbon dioxide would trigger a massive greenhouse effect, sending temperatures soaring even higher than before. This whiplash between extreme cold and extreme heat happened over and over again. Each new pulse of eruptions would trigger another cycle. Freeze, burn, freeze, burn. Any creature that managed to adapt to one extreme would be killed by the next. It was climate change on steroids, methamphetamines, and whatever other performance enhancers you can think of. The oceans, remember those relatively safe oceans we talked about? They absorbed much of that carbon dioxide, which turned them acidic. The pH of seawater dropped so dramatically that anything with a calcium carbonate shell simply dissolved. Coral reefs melted, shellfish turned to goo. The bottom of the marine food chain evaporated, taking everything above it down too. But the ocean's nightmare was just beginning. All that carbon dioxide didn't just make the water acidic, it also made it warmer, much warmer. Ocean temperatures rose by about 10 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. The oceans began to suffocate. Marine dead zones spread across the globe. These weren't small patches of low-oxygen water. These were vast expanses of ocean where nothing could survive. The water turned purple and green from sulfur bacteria, the only things that could live in the new chemical soup that used to be the sea. The smell would have been indescribable. Hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotten eggs their distinctive odour, bubbled up from the depths. Imagine every coastline on Earth smelling like the world's largest sewage treatment plant had exploded. And then, because apparently the planet wasn't trying hard enough to kill everything, the ozone layer started to fail. The massive injection of halogens from the volcanic eruptions ate away at the ozone like cosmic termites. Without that protective layer, ultraviolet radiation reached the surface at levels that would give you third-degree sunburns in minutes, not hours, minutes. Recent studies have found evidence of mutated pollen and spores from this time, their DNA shredded by UV radiation. Plants that managed to survive the acid rain and temperature swings were being cooked at the cellular level by radiation that normally never reaches the ground. Some scientists estimate UV levels increased by 5,000%. That's not a typo. 5,000%. Life on the surface became impossible. actually impossible. The only survivors were things that could hide underground, in caves, or in the deepest parts of the ocean where UV couldn't reach. Everything else died, and when I say everything, I mean everything. 96% of marine species went extinct. 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species vanished. This wasn't an extinction event. This was an attempt at complete biocide. The monsters we've been talking about, those terrifying predators that ruled the land, they didn't stand a chance. Size became a liability. The larger you were, the more food you needed, and there was no food. The more specialized your adaptations, the more vulnerable you became when the environment changed. And the environment didn't just change, it went insane. Those magnificent saber teeth that had evolved over millions of years, useless when there's nothing to hunt, that armor plating that could stop any predator, worthless against acid rain that ate through it like paper, the venom that made you the deadliest creature alive, meaningless when the air itself is poison. The death didn't happen all at once. That would have been too kind. Instead, it was a gradual collapse played out over thousands of years. First, the plants died, poisoned by acid and starved of sunlight. Then the herbivores with nothing to eat. Then the smaller predators. Finally, the apex predators, sitting at the top of a food chain that no longer existed. The fossil record from this time is heartbreaking. We find mass graves where entire herds died together, probably around the last water source before it dried up or became too toxic to drink. We find predator and prey lying side by side, natural enemies united in death. We find burrows packed with skeletons where animals tried to hide from the apocalypse above. But here's the most disturbing part. We find evidence that some creatures almost made it. There are fossils from just after the main extinction pulse that show stunted growth, malformed bones, signs of environmental stress pushed to the absolute limit. These were the survivors of the first wave, trying to eke out an existence in a dead world. Most of them didn't make it through the second wave, or the third. The eruptions just kept coming. The landscape itself transformed into something from another planet. Where forests once stood, nothing remained but stumps of dead trees, bleached white by acid and sun. The ground was covered in ash meters thick like black snow that never melted. Rivers ran red with iron oxide from dissolved rocks. The sky was a permanent twilight, even at noon, from all the particles in the atmosphere. In some places, the heat from underground magma turned groundwater to steam, creating geysers and hot springs everywhere. But these weren't the picturesque geothermal features we see in Yellowstone today. These were toxic cauldrons full of dissolved minerals and acids, surrounded by the bones of animals that had come looking for water and found death instead. The few plants that survived were mostly fungi. In fact, there's a layer in the rock record called the fungal spike, where suddenly fungal spores make up almost 100% of fossilized plant material. For a brief moment in Earth's history, fungi inherited the planet, feeding on the endless corpses of everything else. This is what makes the Lopingian unique in Earth's history. Other mass extinctions were caused by asteroids, ice ages, or changes in ocean chemistry. They were singular events that life could adapt to, given time. But the Siberian traps were relentless. Every time life started to recover, another pulse of eruptions would knock it back down. It was like trying to rebuild a house while someone keeps setting it on fire. The technical term for what happened is a catastrophic cascade failure of Earth's life support systems. Every system that maintains habitability failed simultaneously. The atmosphere became toxic, the oceans became acidic, the ozone layer disappeared, the climate went haywire. The food chains collapsed. It wasn't just that conditions became difficult for life, conditions became antithetical to life. And yet, in the deepest parts of the ocean, in underground burrows, in protected micro-environments, a few things held on. Not the monsters we've been talking about. They were gone, wiped from the earth so thoroughly that most people don't even know they existed. But tiny things, simple things. Things that could survive on almost nothing and reproduce quickly enough to evolve in real time as conditions changed. One of these survivors was a weird little creature you might remember from earlier, that pig lizard thing that could dig. Yeah, that one made it through. While titans fell around it, this ridiculous-looking animal survived the worst catastrophe in Earth's history by hiding underground and eating roots. Evolution, it seems, has a sense of humour. The world that emerged from the Great Dying was alien compared to what came before. Gone were the diverse ecosystems full of specialised predators and prey. In their place was an empty world waiting to be refilled. It would take 10 million years for biodiversity to recover to pre-extinction levels. 10 million years of a broken planet slowly healing itself. The few survivors would eventually give rise to new dynasties. The archosaurs would evolve into dinosaurs and eventually birds. The cynodonts would become mammals. Life would recover, adapt and thrive again, but it would never forget the lesson of the Lopingian. Sometimes the only winning move is not to be there when the world ends. The Siberian traps eventually stopped erupting, though it took them long enough. The carbon dioxide was slowly absorbed by rocks and oceans, the acid rain neutralized, the ozone layer regenerated, the climate stabilized, life crept back from its hiding places and began the long work of repopulating an empty planet. But the scars remained. Even today, 250 million years later, we can see them. The Siberian traps are still there, a monument to the worst period in Earth's history. The rock layers from the extinction are clearly visible, a line in stone that marks the end of one world and the beginning of another. When geologists first discovered evidence of this extinction, they couldn't believe it. Nothing in human experience compared to it. We've had ice ages, volcanic eruptions, even asteroid impacts in human history. But nothing, absolutely nothing, comes close to what happened at the end of the Lopingian. It remains the closest life on Earth has ever come to complete annihilation. Picture walking through a forest where every tree is dead but still standing. Not just dead, bleached white like bones, stripped of bark, branches reaching up like skeletal fingers, no birds, no insects, no sound except wind through hollow wood. Now imagine that forest stretches for thousands of miles. That was Earth after the dying stopped. The world that emerged from the ashes wasn't just damaged, it was fundamentally broken. The rules that governed life for hundreds of millions of years had been shattered. Predator-prey relationships that had existed since complex life began were gone. Entire ecological niches had been erased. Evolution had to start from scratch with whatever random survivors happened to make it through. And the survivors were weird. Really weird. Not the mighty or the strong or the clever, just the lucky and the generalist. Take Thrinaxodon, a cynodont about the size of a cat that somehow made it through. This thing wasn't special. It ate whatever it could find. Insects, carrion, plants, probably its own dead. It could tolerate temperature swings that would kill most modern mammals. It could go without water for extended periods. It wasn't good at anything except not dying. But Thrinaxodon had one trait that would change the world. It cared for its young. Fossil evidence shows adults and juveniles denned together, with adults bringing food back to babies too small to hunt. This parental care, almost unknown in the Permian, became the foundation for all mammalian behavior. Every dog wagging its tail, every cat purring, every human mother holding her child, it all traces back to this unremarkable creature that survived when giants fell. The oceans were even stranger. Remember those purple and green bacterial seas? They didn't go away when the eruptions stopped. For millions of years, the oceans remained stratified. Normal water on top, toxic soup below. Any creature that swam too deep would hit a wall of hydrogen sulfide and die instantly. Marine life was trapped in the shallow surface waters, competing for space in what amounted to a planet-wide tide pool. The winners of this marine Hunger Games were creatures nobody would have predicted: conodonts, tiny eel-like animals with bizarre tooth-like structures, exploded in diversity. These things had been bit players for 200 million years, and suddenly they owned the oceans, not through any special adaptation or evolutionary advantage. They just happened to already live in the surface waters when everything else died. On land, the disaster species took over. These are organisms that thrive in disturbed environments, weeds, basically. For about 5 million years, the entire planet was covered in the Permian equivalent of parking lot dandelions. The same species everywhere, from pole to equator. No regional variation, no local adaptations, just endless monotony. The most successful plant was a club moss called Pluramea. Picture a tree that's just a straight pole with a tuft of leaves on top, like a 30-foot-tall toilet brush. No branches, no complex structure, just the absolute minimum needed to photosynthesize and reproduce. These things covered entire continents in forests that looked like armies of green telephone poles. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The animals that survived showed signs of what scientists call the Lilliput effect. Everything was smaller than before, not just a little smaller, dramatically, impossibly smaller. Lystrosaurs that survived into the Triassic were half the size of their Permian ancestors. Amphibians that had been giants became salamander-sized. It was like the entire planet had been shrunk in the wash. This wasn't evolution selecting for smaller size. This was environmental stress preventing normal growth. The air still had less oxygen. The food was still poor quality. The climate was still unstable. Nothing could grow properly. For millions of years, Earth was populated by dwarfs and runts, stunted shadows of what life used to be. The food chains that developed were pathetic compared to what came before. Instead of complex webs with multiple trophic levels, you had simple chains. Plant, herbivore, carnivore, that's it. No specialization, no diversity, just the bare minimum needed for an ecosystem to function. It was like nature had been reduced to a child's drawing. And the carnivores, they were jokes compared to their predecessors. Proterosuchus, one of the first large predators to evolve after the extinction, looked impressive at 2 meters long, until you realize that before the extinction that would have made it prey. The apex predator of the early Triassic would have been a snack for a mid-sized Permian therocephalian. The empty world created opportunities for the strangest evolutionary experiments. With no competition, anything that could fill a niche did, no matter how bizarre. Take Tanistropheus, a reptile that evolved a neck longer than the rest of its body combined. Not gradually, over millions of years of fine-tuning. Just boom, ridiculous neck. Why? Because it could. There was nothing to stop it, no established predator to punish such an obvious vulnerability. Or consider Charovipteryx, a reptile that evolved wings on its hind legs, not front legs like every flying creature before or since, hind legs. It would have looked like it was wearing feathered pants while gliding backward through the air. This is the kind of nonsense evolution comes up with when there's no competition to weed out the stupid ideas. The recovery happened in waves, each one establishing a new temporary normal before being disrupted by the next. First came the disaster fauna, the lystrosaurs and their kin, spreading across the empty world like locusts. They dominated for about 2 million years, before crashing as suddenly as they'd risen. Nobody knows why. Maybe they ate themselves out of house and home. Maybe a disease swept through their genetically uniform populations. Maybe they just ran out of evolutionary steam. Next came the radiation of the archosauromorphs, the group that would eventually produce crocodiles, dinosaurs and birds, but the early ones were nothing like their famous descendants. Euparkeria was about the size of a house cat, with long legs for running and teeth for eating basically anything. It succeeded not through any special ability, but through sheer reproductive output. They bred like rabbits in a world with no wolves. The seas followed a similar pattern. First came the boom in conodonts and other simple creatures, then the rise of the ichthyosaurs, reptiles that said screw the land and returned to the water. The early ones looked like lizards that had just figured out swimming with barely modified limbs and long, eel-like bodies. They succeeded because the oceans were so empty that being a mediocre marine predator was enough. What nobody talks about is how long the trauma lasted. For 10 million years after the extinction, life showed what scientists call ecological depression. Even when diversity started to return, ecosystems remained unstable. Boom and bust cycles, where populations would explode, then crash. Mass die-offs for no apparent reason. It was like the entire biosphere had PTSD. The carbon cycle was completely screwed. Normally, plants absorb carbon dioxide, animals eat plants, everything dies and decomposes, releasing carbon back. Simple, but with so few organisms, carbon just accumulated in the atmosphere. The planet stayed hot, acidic, and hostile far longer than it should have. Life couldn't fix the planet because there wasn't enough life to do the fixing. Weather patterns during the recovery were insane. Without plant cover to moderate temperatures and humidity, you'd get temperature swings of 40 degrees Celsius in a single day. Morning frost, afternoon like a furnace. Rainfall would be either nothing for years or everything at once. Flash floods were so common they became the primary method of fossil preservation. Most Triassic fossils are creatures that got caught in floods. That tells you something about what life was like. The first real forests didn't return for 8 million years. 8 million. The Amazon rainforest has existed for maybe 55 million years, and we think that's ancient. The planet went without proper forests for a time period equal to the entire evolution of apes into humans. When trees finally did come back, they were different. Conifers mostly, able to handle the still harsh conditions. The lush, complex forests of the Permian were gone forever. But life is nothing if not persistent. Slowly, painfully, complexity returned. Food webs became actual webs again instead of simple chains. Specialists began to emerge. Regional differences developed. The world started to look less like a post-apocalyptic wasteland and more like a functioning planet. And then something remarkable happened. About 20 million years after the extinction, life didn't just recover, it exploded. The Triassic radiation produced more body plans, more ecological strategies, more evolutionary innovations than had been seen since the Cambrian explosion. Pterosaurs took to the air, dinosaurs began their march toward dominance, mammals started their long journey toward consciousness. It was as if the trauma of the extinction had somehow supercharged evolution. The survivors, freed from the constraints of established ecosystems, tried everything. Flight, gigantism, miniaturization, armor, speed, intelligence. Every possible survival strategy was tested. Most failed, but the ones that worked changed the world forever. The first true dinosaurs appeared about 20 million years after the extinction. Not the giants we picture, those would come later. The first ones were small bipedal creatures no bigger than chickens, but they had something special, an upright gait that let them run faster and farther than anything else. In a world where mobility meant survival, they were Formula One cars competing against horse-drawn carts. The early mammals were even less impressive, tiny, nocturnal, living in the shadows of reptiles that would dominate the world for the next 160 million years. But they had developed something revolutionary: true warm-bloodedness, insulation, and complex brains. They were playing a different game entirely, one that wouldn't pay off for millions of years. The legacy of the great dying shaped everything that came after. The age of dinosaurs only happened because the extinction cleared the way. Mammals only got their chance because dinosaurs got theirs first. Every ecosystem on modern Earth, from rainforests to coral reefs, exists because the Permian ones were destroyed. We literally live in the aftermath of the Lopingian catastrophe. Even today, 250 million years later, you can see the scars. There are groups of animals that never recovered their Permian diversity, gaps in the fossil record that mark where entire lineages vanished, chemical signatures in rocks that record the planet's near-death experience. The Siberian traps themselves, now worn down but still visible, a monument to the worst thing that ever happened to life on Earth. Scientists studying the great dying have a saying: the Permian extinction didn't just change what lived on Earth, it changed what was possible. The disaster reset the rules of evolution, destroyed the old order, and created space for entirely new forms of life. Without it, there would be no dinosaurs, no mammals, no birds, no flowers, no us. Which brings us back to that fundamental question: when was water safer than land? The answer is both simple and profound. During the Lopingian, the oceans were safer not because they were good, but because the land was impossible. The water was dying slowly while the land was dying fast. Sometimes safety isn't about finding somewhere nice, it's about finding somewhere slightly less horrible than everywhere else. The creatures that lived through this had no idea they were living through history's greatest catastrophe. They just knew that yesterday was bad, today was worse, and tomorrow didn't look promising. They couldn't see that their suffering would reshape the entire trajectory of life on Earth. They were just trying to make it through another day in a world that seemed determined to kill them. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Lopingian. Not that life is fragile, it clearly isn't since it survived this. Not that extinction is always bad. Sometimes it creates opportunities for new forms of life. The lesson is that when the world ends, it's not really the end. It's a transformation. A horrible, traumatic, almost universally fatal transformation, but a transformation nonetheless. So here we are at the end of the world that was and the beginning of the world that would be. But there's something I haven't told you yet, something that changes everything about how we understand this story. The water wasn't just safer by accident. The water was safer because physics itself made it that way. See, when hell breaks loose on land, water does this amazing thing. It buffers. Every chemistry student learns this, but nobody really thinks about what it means. Water absorbs heat 30 times more efficiently than air. It dilutes poisons, it blocks radiation, it maintains temperature. When the land turned into a furnace, the deep ocean stayed cool. When acid rain fell, the ocean's volume made it survivable. When UV radiation scorched the surface, water filtered it out within a few meters. This is why, even in the absolute worst of the catastrophe, things survived in the deep ocean that couldn't have lasted 5 minutes on land. Not because they were tougher or better adapted, just because water, by its very nature, refuses to change as quickly as air. It's stubborn at a molecular level. There's a place in Russia called Vyazniki where you can actually see this moment frozen in stone. The rock layers tell the story like a book. At the bottom, you've got the late Permian, full of fossils, evidence of complex life variety. Then there's a layer of black rock with almost nothing in it, the death layer. Above that, mostly empty limestone with a few scattered shells, but if you look at the ocean deposits from the same time, there's still life. Stressed, struggling, simplified life, but life nonetheless. The researchers who first discovered this couldn't believe it. They kept checking their data, thinking they'd made a mistake. How could the ocean have any survivors when the land was so completely devastated? But then they did the math on heat capacity, chemical buffering, radiation shielding. The ocean wasn't thriving, it was just failing slower. Think about the last time you were in a pool on a really hot day. The air might be 40 degrees Celsius, unbearable, but the pool is still refreshing. Now imagine the air is literally poisonous, raining acid and irradiated. The pool is still your best bet, even if it's not exactly pleasant. That was the entire ocean during the Lopingian extinction. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The very thing that made water safer also made recovery harder. Land ecosystems, once the conditions improved even slightly, could rebuild quickly. New plants could colonize empty ground in years. New animals could radiate into empty niches in thousands of years. But the ocean held onto its trauma. Those toxic, deep layers I mentioned, they persisted for millions of years after the eruptions stopped. The ocean stratification that protected some life also prevented mixing, which prevented recovery. It was like the ocean had developed scar tissue that wouldn't heal. Land life, devastated as it was, actually recovered faster than marine life in many ways. This is why the Triassic Ocean remained weirdly empty even as life on land started experimenting with new forms. The Marine Revolution, when seas finally recovered their complexity, took 50 million years. 50 million. The land had already produced dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and early mammals before the ocean got its act together. But the craziest part, we can see this same pattern happening today. Right now, climate change is heating the land faster than the oceans. Extreme weather events are worse on land. Habitat destruction is more severe on land. Once again, not because the oceans are healthy. They're definitely not. But because water's physical properties make it resistant to rapid change. Modern coral bleaching, that's happening because ocean temperatures rose 2 degrees. The land has seen temperature increases of 4 to 6 degrees in some places. The Amazon is becoming savanna, the Arctic tundra is melting, but the deep ocean, still cold, still stable, still buffering against the worst of it, for now. The parallels are unsettling, not the scale. We're nowhere near Siberian traps levels of catastrophe, but the pattern. Land systems failing fast, ocean systems degrading slowly, and everyone focused on the immediate crisis while missing the long-term implications. The Lopingian teaches us that sometimes the refuge is temporary. Sometimes safer doesn't mean safe. There's this moment in the fossil record that haunts paleontologists. It's from about 251 million years ago, right at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic. In marine deposits, you find these things called wrinkle structures. They're basically bacterial mats, the kind you'd see in the most primitive environments on Earth. For a brief moment, the entire ocean reverted to conditions that hadn't existed since before complex life evolved. 3 billion years of evolution undone. But in those same deposits, you also find tiny shells, chloria, eumorphatis, unionites, simple bivalves that somehow hung on. They weren't impressive, they weren't diverse, they were just there, filtering water, making shells, refusing to quit. These pathetic little clams were the seed from which all future marine ecosystems would grow. On land, it was even weirder. The first community to really establish itself after the extinction was something scientists call the Lystrosaurus assemblage. Remember that pig lizard thing? It basically inherited the Earth. For about 2 million years, this one genus made up 90% of all vertebrate fossils. 90%. Imagine if 9 out of every 10 animals you saw was exactly the same species. That was the entire planet. But Lystrosaurus had a secret weapon nobody expected. It was too boring to die. It didn't need special food. It didn't need specific temperatures. It didn't need complex ecosystems. It just needed dirt to dig in and roots to eat. While everything specialized died, the generalist inherited the Earth. There's probably a lesson in that. The recovery wasn't a return to what was before. That world was gone forever. Instead, life built something completely new on the ashes of the old. The Mesozoic world, the age of dinosaurs everyone knows about, had almost nothing in common with the Paleozoic world that came before. Different players, different rules, different game entirely. The dinosaurs that would eventually dominate the planet, they succeeded because they were nothing like what came before. Upright stance instead of sprawling, fast metabolism instead of slow, complex social behaviors instead of solitary hunting. They weren't better than Permian animals. They were just different, adapted to a world that Permian animals never had to face. And the mammals hiding in their shadows, they were playing an even longer game, developing traits that wouldn't matter for another 100 million years. Intelligence, social bonding, extended parental care, survival strategies that seemed pointless in a world ruled by giants, but would prove decisive when the next catastrophe came. Because that's the other lesson of the Lopingian. Catastrophes don't stop. The Siberian traps were the worst, but they weren't the last. The Triassic ended with another extinction. The Jurassic had one too. The Cretaceous ended with an asteroid. Each time, the survivors weren't the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who happened to have the right traits for a challenge nobody could have predicted. Water saved life during the Lopingian because water follows rules that catastrophes can't break. Physics doesn't care about volcanic eruptions. Chemistry doesn't care about mass death. Water will always absorb heat at the same rate, always dissolve gases the same way, always block radiation at the same depth. In a world going insane, water remained boringly, predictably, gloriously stable. But stability isn't the same as safety. The ocean survivors didn't thrive. They endured. They hung on in a diminished world, waiting for conditions to improve. Some waited millions of years. Some are still waiting. There are deep-sea organisms today that trace their lineage directly back to Lopingian survivors, having never left the abyss that saved them. The final irony, the thing that made the Lopingian unique, water being safer than land, also made it temporary. As soon as conditions improved even slightly, life exploded back onto land with a vengeance. The ocean refugees returned to shore and became reptiles, then dinosaurs, then birds. The underground survivors emerged and became mammals. The safe haven of water was abandoned as soon as it was no longer needed. Today, we live on a planet shaped entirely by this moment. Every ecosystem, every evolutionary lineage, every survival strategy traces back to the Great Dying and its aftermath. We are all descendants of the desperate few who found refuge in water, underground, or in the margins while the world burned. When you swim in the ocean, you're entering the same refuge that saved life 250 million years ago. When you see a bird, you're looking at a descendant of survivors who made it through by hiding in water. When you pet a dog, you're touching a creature whose ancient ancestors survived by being too boring to notice while monsters died around them. The Lopingian asks a question that echoes through time. What do you do when nowhere is safe, but some places are less deadly than others? The answer life found was simple. You take the less deadly option and hope it's enough. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it's always better than giving up. We'll never see anything like the Lopingian again. The conditions that created it, a single supercontinent, a massive volcanic province hitting coal deposits, an already stressed biosphere, won't align the same way, but we will see other catastrophes, other moments when the rules change and survival becomes a lottery. When those moments come, remember the Lopingian. Remember that sometimes the winner isn't the strongest or the smartest, but the one who finds the right refuge at the right time. Remember that water, boring and predictable water, saved life on Earth simply by being itself. And remember that even the worst catastrophe in history wasn't actually the end. It was just another beginning wearing a very convincing disguise. The Lopingian ended 252 million years ago. The world it created ended 66 million years ago when an asteroid reset everything again. The world that asteroid created is ending now, as humans reshape the planet in ways not seen since the Siberian traps. Each ending is also a beginning. Each catastrophe is also an opportunity. Each moment when water becomes safer than land is just physics telling biology to wait, be patient, this too shall pass. And it always does. Eventually. Even if it takes 10 million years. That's the story of the only time in history when water was safer than land. Not because water was good, but because land had become impossible. Not because the ocean was thriving, but because it was dying with more dignity than the continents. Not because aquatic life was superior, but because physics gave it an edge that evolution couldn't. In the end, the Lopingian teaches us that survival isn't about being the best. It's about being in the right place when everything goes wrong. And sometimes, just sometimes, that place is underwater, waiting for the world to stop ending. So the next time you're at the beach watching the waves roll in, remember this. You're looking at Earth's ultimate survivor, not the life in it, but the water itself, the thing that refuses to change quickly enough to die, the substance that saved life by simply being too stubborn to boil, too massive to poison, too deep to irradiate. Water, Earth's most boring hero, and thank God for that.